Good afternoon and welcome to the City Club of Cleveland. I'm Dan Moulthrop, Chief Executive Officer here at the City Club and also a proud member. It's my pleasure to introduce to you our speaker today, Brandon Busteed, Executive Director for Education and Workforce Development at Gallup. When polled on issues that are most important to them in an election cycle, Americans overwhelmingly respond that education and the economy are the top priorities. Arguably, we haven't done much as a society to create sustainable linkages between the two. A recent poll, from Gallup no less, found that student engagement in the classroom is declining. Student job preparedness is questionable at best, and the common perception of the purpose of college is all about getting a job and not a degree, or, for that matter, just learning. Our speaker today argues that in order for America to continue as a leader of the free world, it needs to put more resources into getting education and economy working together more effectively. Doing this requires America to create an, quote, educonomy, seamlessly integrating our educational system, its employers, and job creators. Throughout his career, Mr. Busteed has served in a variety of roles, including educational entrepreneur, speaker, writer, and university trustee. In his role as Executive Director of Education and Workforce Development, Mr. Busteed integrates Gallup's research and science on talent selection, strengths, engagement, and well-being to improve student success, teacher effectiveness, and educational outcomes. His mission is to create a national movement to measure the educational outcomes that matter most and connect education to jobs and job creation and promote a paradigm shift from knowledge mastery to emotional engagement in education. Mr. Busteed has founded 2 companies and 1 nonprofit as a social entrepreneur. He's the founder and former CEO of Outside the Classroom, a company that pioneered adaptive online education in alcohol abuse prevention. It was acquired by EverFi in 2011. Mr. Busteed received his bachelor's degree in public policy from Duke University and an honorary doctorate from Augustana College. Ladies and gentlemen, members and friends of the City Club of Cleveland, please welcome Brandon Busteed.
I'm thrilled to be here, first of all, because this kind of audience is my favorite kind of audience. And what I mean by that is I think it's really important that we start to talk about education from a number of different angles. We go to a lot of conferences where we just sit with other educators, or people just from K-12, or people just from higher ed. There's a lot of great business forums out there. There's a lot of policy forums. It's rare that you'll get an audience like this where you have leaders from the K-12 world, from higher education, from various philanthropic, nonprofit, government, business entities. And by far, it's the most important kind of gathering that I ever go to. So I'm most looking forward to the Q&A, because that's the part where I get to have fun and learn. And I'm eager to hear some of your questions. So first of all, it's an honor to speak here. I'm well aware of the history of this place, and so I will try and do a great service by contributing something interesting before I'm done. But being at Gallup is a pretty special thing. You know, many of you know the name because of our polling. And in many ways, and I say this not to be, it's going to come across the wrong way, but it's in many ways the least important thing we do in the grand scheme of all the research that Gallup does. A lot of our research is in the service of large organizations, businesses, nonprofit, government entities, helping them do critical things like improve the engagement of their employees, improve the well-being of their employees, or if you think about it in the school setting, the engagement and well-being of teachers and students. So I'm going to share a whole bunch of research, but I just want to start by grounding us all in this conversation, because I think as Americans we've kind of lost our minds in a way when we're thinking about education. We've gotten so over the top in so many different ways that I actually think that we've lost track of the fundamentals in this whole thing. So I'm going to ask you my personal favorite Gallup poll question that we've ever asked, and you guys get to participate. And so what we did is we asked Americans to think about the best teacher that they've ever had. Usually we don't ask open-ended questions in a poll because, of course, that takes a lot of time for the interviewer to write that question down and then analyze that, so it's usually a set of selected answers. This was an open-ended question, but the prompt was to think about the best teacher you've ever had. So I'd like you all to do that right now. Put that person's name in your head, if you haven't already. My guess is it didn't take anybody here more than a split second to think about that. And then what we asked them was to describe what was it that made that person the best teacher that you've ever had. And I'm not a mind reader. This is thanks to Gallup research that I know probably the word that most of you are using to describe this. You know what the number one word that Americans use to describe their best teacher? What was it? Inspiring. Relationship. Cared. You're all very close. If you didn't say care, you said something very close to care. Here's why I think that's so important. How are we measuring caring in schools today? Just pause and think about this. It sounds like such a soft, fluffy thing, but think of how important it is. Now, it's not as simple as just showing somebody some love, although that's part of it. Because, see, a lot of us felt cared for because someone pushed us. They made us work hard, and we worked hard for them because we knew they cared. I had a principal who came up to me after a talk I gave about this, and he said, "You validated everything I believed for 30 years. He said, "My whole mantra in my career has been, they don't care about what you know until they know that you care." And so I just want to start there, because in this world of crazy, overcomplicated discussions we're having about education, I think that we've just simply lost track of the fundamentals. So let me start with some interesting data on a number of things, and I shared this earlier this morning, but this was a piece of information Gallup got lucky on because we asked 3 similar questions of 3 different groups. The first one was provosts, chief academic officers of colleges and universities. And we asked them how well they think they're doing on preparing students for success in the workplace. It turns out that 96% are either somewhat or extremely confident that they're doing a good job. That probably translates to giving themselves a self-grade of an A+, right? So then we asked a representative sample of Americans what they think. So to what degree do you think college graduates are well prepared for success in the workplace? And it turns out that only 14% of Americans strongly agree that they're well prepared. So the third audience were C-level business executives. And the answer there is 11% strongly agree that college graduates have the skills necessary to fill the jobs they're looking to fill. Now, we're having a conversation about this thing we call a skills gap in America, right? You know, we've got almost 5 million unfilled jobs. We've got unemployment and underemployment rates that are still way too high for our liking. And so you go, well, what's going on there? There's a lot going on there, but I can't explain. I mean, the gap between 96% and 11% on that report card, that's not a gap. That's more of a Grand Canyon, right? And so there's a lot going on. Our perceptions of how well we're doing are obviously in very different places, and the reality probably is true as well. So I want to kind of take those opposite ends of the spectrum in terms of how we feel we're doing and give you some insight as to why I think there's such a disparity. So the first is I want to start in the K-12 system. We run our Gallup student poll, which last year surveyed almost 1 million 5th through 12th graders across the United States. And we surveyed them about their hope, engagement, and well-being. Things that sound very soft and fluffy, like that word care that I shared earlier. It turns out the first challenge is a lot of people don't think you can measure these things. And that's just not untrue. It's not just Gallup alone. There's all kinds of folks that have shown that you can reliably measure things like hope and engagement and grit and well-being. The second hurdle you've got to get people over is that if you believe that those things can be measured, do they actually matter? And there's a whole lot of evidence that they don't just matter, but they may matter more than all of the metrics that we're using now to define the success of a student, a teacher, a principal, a superintendent, a school district, a state, and a country. Now, I'm not going to say that we throw out things like grades and test scores, but I will say that I think we have a very unhealthy relationship with those metrics in that we have put so much weight on them, we have overemphasized their importance so much that we've lost track of all the other myriad ways to measure success and the pathways to achieve it. So, here's a crazy little piece of data. It turns out that in the 32 countries where there's overlapping data between PISA standardized test scores and the global entrepreneurship measure, which measures entrepreneurial energy at a country level, it's a negative correlation. That is, the countries who have higher standardized test scores have lower levels of entrepreneurial energy. I was on a panel 2 years ago with the ambassador from Singapore. They're number one in the world in standardized math testing. And he was there because everybody in the audience wanted to know, how did you do it? Because they want to be like Singapore. And I kid you not, the very first thing out of his mouth was, well, we're proud of what we've done on our math scores. He said, but what we're most worried about in Singapore is the creativity and innovation and entrepreneurship of our students and the citizens in our nation. That's where he started. Now here's my point. These things don't need to be mutually exclusive. And I'm not trying to paint them as mutually exclusive. But if all we focus on is how we're doing on PISA scores, we don't feel very good about how we're doing as a country. And we're not doing that great on PISA scores. But is that the only way that we want to measure success? Is that the only thing that we're aiming at? Absolutely not. But yet for the average parent today and the average student, it's the end of the world if they don't get a good score on the SAT or the ACT or have a 4.0 GPA. Now here's an interesting one. In higher ed, the average GPA has gone up 1.1 points in the last 30 years. It's what I might refer to as rampant grade inflation. Because see, a 2.3 30 years ago was really a 3.4. A lot of people in the room are probably feeling a lot better about their GPA 30 years ago. As an employer, I have no idea what a 3.4 means anymore, and I don't know what a 3.4 means from one institution to the next. In fact, I do know what it means. It's perfectly average. But here's the interesting thing. Google, if you missed this news, this was probably the most important news in the education world, and it wouldn't have hit you immediately because it was news from Google. It was an interview that was done with the SVP of People at Google, asking him about what Google has learned about big data in HR. And among a number of things that he cited, towards the end of the interview, they asked him this throwaway question like, anything else that was interesting? And he said, oh yeah, there was. He said, we found no relationship whatsoever between the grades and test scores of candidates and how well they do at Google, so we've stopped asking. Pause on this a minute. The world's most admired employer, they're either number one or number two, depending on which year. Apple and Google have flopped back and forth, but let's just say for now, the number one most admired employer in the world has stopped asking about grades and test scores because they've found that it doesn't matter for them. Now, this is not me saying we just completely rid ourselves of testing and grades, not at all. But I want to make the point very clearly. Those are necessary but horribly insufficient metrics to judge success on. And so we need to think about what are the other things that we can measure? What are the other activities that line a student up for success in their career and their lives? And this is something that Gallup actually has a very unique position around because we've measured two things deeper, further, longer than any organization in the world. The first is workplace engagement, the degree to which people are engaged in their work. And this is a standard across all types of organizations, types of jobs all over the world. We've now interviewed about 29 million people in 163 countries about their workplace engagement. It may be the largest study of human beings on the planet if you think about it through that lens. And we've also measured well-being now for 70 plus years. In fact, it was one of George Gallup's driving research obsessions, is what he called trying to quantify a life well lived, which is such an elegant way of describing it. We simply refer to it as well-being now, but that's essentially what it is. It's how people rate and evaluate their lives. So here's the point. We've studied these two things, and we found that there are elements that matter for everybody in the world, no matter who you are, right? This cuts across countries, age, religion, ethnicity, any way you want to think about it. These are the fundamentals, I would argue, of human development. And here's what they are. I'll just give you quick examples, right? Being engaged in work is not an activity level of engagement. It's an emotional level of engagement with your work and with your workplace. So one question that's hugely predictive of your success in your job, your productivity, whether you are absent or sick, how long you stay in the organization, your healthcare costs to the company. One of the ones we get criticized most is whether you strongly agree that you have a best friend at work. But I'm telling you now, if you strongly agree to that, you're better off on all those things I've just mentioned than someone who doesn't. It turns out that's also a great one to nail student engagement in school, because if a student says, I have a best friend at school, it's a huge driver of their engagement. And it just makes sense. Other ones are whether you can strongly agree that you have a chance to do what you're best at each day. That's probably, arguably, the single most important one. And you can say strongly agree to that whether you're a student, whether you're in a career, or whether you're a retiree. And the statement isn't worded as all day long. Very few of us have a chance to do what we're best at all day long, but at some point in the day, if you can't touch that moment, that's something that you want to try to aim at. Unfortunately, about 30% of Americans strongly agree they have a chance to do what they're best at each day. Can you imagine what this country would look like if that was 60% or 70%? What school performance would look like if that was at 60 or 70%? It would be unbelievable. See, I think we kind of we guide students astray a little bit in telling them to go for their passion. That's kind of true, but look, there's a lot of people who had a passion for playing the guitar and could never make money doing it. That's okay. Play guitar in your garage at night. Some people will be successful playing guitar for money, but very few. So see, just saying follow your passion isn't necessarily the best thing. If you can combine your interests with what you're really good at, your natural talents, the things that come naturally to you, and if you can do that all the time, that's what gets you to a place where some people have called, you've heard the term flow. Flow is when you're doing something and you lose track of time. Flow happens in part because you're interested in what you're doing, but it happens probably more importantly because you're doing something that you excel at. Something where you know that you're doing something that you're as good as anybody else in the world at doing. Here's the thing about talent, and this is as true as anything I can tell you. Talent is like a fingerprint. Every single human being on the planet has a unique talent signature. The question is whether they're putting it to use every day. So see, talents are not strengths unless they're applied on a regular basis. It's like a muscle. You can have muscles, but if they're not used, they atrophy. Here's the problem with this in schools. Less than 50% of students in America today say they have a chance to do what they're best at each day in school. Now, if I were going to encourage us to just think about one metric, we don't need to turn this into a big accountability nightmare. We don't need, right? But a metric that's important for a parent and a student and anybody involved in a school to pay attention to would just be that one. How many students can get to that point where they go, yep, I touched that moment today, even if it was for only 20 minutes or a 40-minute period? We have so many opportunities to create that for students, and yet we're not doing a great job. Student engagement in school goes down every year they're in school. 76% of elementary students are engaged, drops to 61% in middle school, 44% in high school. If I showed you every year in school, it just goes down every year. The only year where it plateaus is between 10th and 11th grade, and that's because that's the year where most students drop out. You're just getting rid of the actively disengaged ones. If we were doing this right, that line ought to at least be maintained, if not going in the opposite direction. Instead, it's going like this. Now, that's the national portrait. Here's what I'll tell you that's very promising. There are schools all over this country, high schools, whose engagement levels are off the charts. Higher than any kind of elementary school, 80% of students engaged. We have models of success all over this country. The problem is we just haven't brought it to scale. And most of these models of success are not by the nature of the building or how much money the school district has or what kind of curriculum they're implementing. It's actually more fundamental than that. It's the people in that building. It's the principal who sets the tone of great leadership or not. It's the teachers who are engaged in their own workplace or not. And by the way, if you want to drive student engagement, just back that up real quick. The number one driver of student engagement is teacher engagement. Number one driver of teacher engagement is a great principal leader. So here's what I'm saying about this. These are not simple things to fix or improve, but they don't, I would argue, cost money. Throwing more money at the problem helps us very little. But if we think differently about what we value and the values that we espouse, that changes everything. Because if the only thing we value is how students do on a standardized test or what their GPA is, you can see how we don't leave room for students to explore and figure out what they're best at in school each day. Because we don't have the time. And no one's measuring me and rewarding me on that, but they are on this. I think principals have one of the toughest jobs in the country right now because they're between a rock and a hard place. The only way they're being measured is what's happening with test scores and grades, and graduation rates to some degree. But you can see how you can start to game all those metrics. Make it easier for students to get out. You give them easier grades. You know, one of the only things that correlates with faculty evaluations from students at a collegiate level is just the grades that they give. So the highest rated faculty are the ones who give the easiest A's. There's pretty much your whole story. So here's some stuff that I'm worried about. If you look at the opportunities students have that are linked to becoming successful later in life, and I'll define success, engaged in their work and thriving in their well-being, here's what we know, and this is really important stuff. I've already explained to you that engagement and well-being are not nice to have, but need to have. But I just want to make one further point on that. Well-being, for example, we define in five elements of well-being: purpose, social, financial, physical, and community. I'm not going to go into the details of those, but only to say that if you're thriving in all five of those elements, the way we measure it, you have 1/3 of the healthcare cost burden to your organization than somebody who's not thriving in any. And you don't have to get somebody thriving in all five. For every element, you can get a person to a place of thriving on that 5-element scale. The healthcare cost burden to the organization just keeps going down. These are not soft metrics. Caring and engagement and well-being are not nice to have. They are critical, especially as you think about our current healthcare tab in the United States, which is around 2.7 trillion, going towards 2.9, which is bigger than the entire GDP of Russia by a good margin. So you could argue that one of the things that's bankrupting the United States, or people who make this case, is our healthcare tab. So do you think well-being is a nice to have or a need to have? Should we wait to teach people about what it means to lead a great life when they get to work? Or could we think of a way to start to help them understand that at every level that they go through the education system in? So we've done several studies, but I'm going to explain this to you through the lens of college graduates. Because at the end of the day, what do we say the goal of every school district in America is to make you college and career ready. I'm going to talk about career readiness and college readiness through the lens of the largest representative study that's ever been done on college graduates. Last year we recruited 30,000 college graduates. It is by far the largest representative study of college graduates that's ever been done. It's also pathetically the only large-scale representative study of college graduates that's ever been done. Pause on that point for a minute. Right? We have had an industry, if you want to call it that, right? A thing called higher education for several hundred years in our country. We've never measured the outcomes beyond one fact that we've known, which is that people who get a bachelor's degree make more money over their lifetime. That's the one thing we know about college. But I've yet to read a single college mission statement anywhere in this country that says their mission is to ensure that graduates earn more money over their lifetime than people who don't go there. It doesn't exist in any mission statement I've ever seen. So great that that's an outcome. It's not an unimportant outcome. It's a very critical one. But you say, what about all the things that they profess around their mission? Their mission, lifelong learning, engaged citizens, right? I mean, we can go down a long list. Even thriving and well-being are in these statements. How are we doing on that? Here's where we are. Only about 39% of college graduates in the U.S. are engaged in their work. We could be doing a heck of a lot better. Only 11% are thriving in all 5 elements of well-being, which barely outpaces the national average. About 7.5% of Americans are thriving in all 5 elements. It's a pretty high bar. But you'd think college graduates would be doing considerably better. Here's the crazy thing. 1 in 6 college graduates in the U.S. aren't thriving in a single element. Aren't thriving in a single element. Now, what we found was that your likelihood of being engaged in work and thriving in your well-being later in life had nothing to do with the categorical type of institution you graduated from. No difference between public and private, no difference between highly selective and not, no difference between the top 100 ranked schools in U.S. News and World Report and everybody else on those outcomes. We have rankings. Those rankings have nothing to do with outcomes. They have everything to do with inputs. So we rank the best colleges based on the highest SAT scores, the incoming GPA from high school. We've done nothing to measure the learning growth and development of students from when they matriculate to when they graduate. There is no such measure and no such ranking. We have no idea what the best colleges and universities are in this country on those particular metrics. What we did find was that although the type of institution you graduated from didn't really matter, how you took advantage of college makes a huge difference. So graduates who strongly agreed to these 3 questions, what we called emotionally supported, doubles their odds of being engaged in work over their lifetime, and they're 3 times as likely to be thriving in their overall well-being. They strongly agreed. Ask yourselves these questions. 5 strongly agree. Forget about the rest of the scale because it only matters if you strongly agree. Can you strongly agree to these questions? I had at least 1 professor who made me excited about learning. How many? Just throw up your hands. Strongly agree that the professors at my alma mater cared about me as a person. I had a mentor who encouraged my goals and dreams. Oh, you guys are good. 63% of all college graduates said they had at least one professor who made them excited about learning. A mere 27% felt the professors cared about them as a person, and only 2 out of 10 had a mentor who encouraged their goals and dreams. There's probably a reason why you're here today, because you guys are hitting those marks probably 2 times higher than the national average. Now, we found 3 other deep learning experiential elements that also double your odds of being engaged at work. They have a little relationship with well-being, but not nearly as much as the emotional support ones I just shared. And these 3 were that you said you worked on a long-term project that took a semester or more to complete. Doesn't that sound like a relatively low bar for every college graduate to hit? This one continues to bother me every time I share it. Less than a third of all college graduates strongly agreed that they had a long-term project that took a semester or more to complete. The other one was whether they said they had a job or an internship where they applied what they were learning in the classroom. This was a sorting question because we also asked, did you have a paid job in college, yes or no? That didn't sort. But if you had one where you felt like you applied what you were learning, that makes a real difference. And the final one was also a sorting question because we asked a long list of extracurricular activities you could have been involved in, but this one was whether you strongly agreed that you were extremely involved in an extracurricular activity or organization. Here's the problem. Only 6% of all college graduates in the U.S. hit the mark on all 3 of those. And you say, okay, what percent hit all 6 of these rather special things that seem to have a very, very healthy relationship with career and life success later? If you say strongly agree to all 6, congratulations, you're a 2.7%er. Now here's what's crazy about that. If you look at the spectrum of college graduates who hit 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6 of those key 6 things I've mentioned, this is the first shocker. 25% of all college graduates are a 0 on those metrics. A full quarter managed somehow to spend 4 or more years in college and not hit the mark on those important elements. Understand that all of them, 100% of the people in this data set, got a diploma. They met all the academic requirements to graduate, and they all received the same piece of paper as everybody else. But see, a quarter of them missed out on all these critical experiences, and it goes both ways. It's most certainly about what a student does to take advantage of their education, but it is also very much about what the people, the staff and faculty, and that institution do to increase the probability that those things happen for more students. I'll just share a little bit of interesting and good news with you, is that when we cut this data by minority classes, when we cut this data by first-generation students, there are virtually no differences in the likelihood that students hit the mark on those measures. So unlike a lot of other things that we measure where there are big disparities, right? Big disparities in college-going rates for minorities, big disparities in college completion, big disparities even in earnings after graduation. We still have really big gaps. But on the likelihood of being engaged in your work and thriving in your well-being, if you are a minority graduate, you have just as likely a chance of being engaged and thriving as a white graduate from college. So on that measure at least, the American dream is very real. But you see how we can go wrong on so much of this? If our whole perspective is just the things that we're tracking now, we miss so much. We miss so many of the things that we know to be true and rich in our own developmental experiences. And so somehow we've got to get back to that. And it's only going to happen in spite of the system, not because of it. Here's what I mean. Why should we think that colleges are doing much better than they are on some of those emotional support measures? Because if we're honest, higher ed in general does very little to motivate, reward, promote, do anything for people to spend more time caring about students and mentoring them. The people who are doing it on college campuses now are doing it in spite of the rewards and values that are emphasized, not because of them. We know the expression. If you want to be a tenured faculty member, it's publish or perish. And by the way, spending some extra time with students actually kind of gets in the way of that. It's annoying. Why should I spend any time doing that? Because no one's told me that that's valuable, because I know how I'm being rewarded here, and it's not going down that path. So it's going to be individuals, teachers, faculty members, professors, parents, students who are going to have to start to honestly own this and step back from this. So here's a simple choice that a lot of parents and students are making against Gallup research. They avoid taking tough classes. They avoid taking classes with long-term projects. Why? Because they're harder and they might get a lower grade. So in the service of trying to get a higher GPA, they take the easier class, the easier route. And the parent and the student both today, the average parent and the average student, endorse that path. But I would much rather take a B student who has challenged him or herself with long-term projects, internships that integrate what they're learning, has invested in mentoring relationships, has sought out not the course but the professor. See how you can go wrong? If you pick based on the courses you need to get, you might miss out on all the great professors that you need to have. Pick the professor, not the course. Go for the harder thing that challenges you more, not the easier grade. But you see where we're all going wrong? We're all making a mistake because we put so much value and emphasis on this very narrow set of metrics that boils down to how we define success. And we need to change. Thank you very much.
Again, I'm Dan Moulthrop, Chief Executive here at the City Club, and we don't endorse forums, we don't endorse speakers, but I would just like to point out that our best programs are ones that take a familiar issue and present them in a completely new and provocative way. I think we got that today. Thank you, Brandon. We are enjoying a forum featuring Brandon Busteed. He's the Executive Director of Education and Workforce Development at Gallup, and we encourage you to organize your questions for Mr. Busteed now and remind you that your questions should be brief and to the point. If you're joining us via our webcast and would like to tweet a question, we encourage that too. Simply tweet it at the City Club. We welcome all of you here and those joining us via the web stream provided by our primary media partner, 90.3 WCPN, WVIZ PBS, 104.9 WCLV Idea Stream, or one of the many radio stations across the country that carry City Club programs. Production and distribution of City Club is made possible by Cleveland State University and PNC. Be sure to join us next Friday, October 2nd, as we welcome Janine English. She's president of AARP, and we'll be having a conversation on the importance of creating communities for all ages. For more information about any of our upcoming and past programs, please visit us online at cityclub.org. Education programs at the City Club are sponsored by the Nordson Corporation. Thank you for your support. Today's forum is also the Progressive Corporation Endowed Forum on Progress, made possible by a generous endowment gift from Progressive. We thank them for their support as well. Our community partners for today's forum are Cleveland State University's Center for Educational Leadership and the Greater Cleveland School Superintendents Association. We thank you very much for your partnership. Additionally, we welcome guests at tables hosted by Youth Opportunities Unlimited. Thank you very much for joining us today. We also welcome students to today's forum from St. Martin de Porres High School. Student participation is made possible by the Jeffrey David Epstein Memorial Fund. We thank you very much for joining us. Now it's time to return to Mr. Busteed for our traditional City Club Q&A. Holding our microphones today are City Club Director of Programming, Stephanie Jansky, and our Marketing and Outreach Fellow, Faye Walker. Can we have our first question, please?
Thanks. Thank you, Mr. Busteed. Very interesting presentation. I appreciated it. So I'd like to ask about K-12 education. Mm-hmm. And in this era of high-stakes accountability, I've found that in talking with school administrators, many of them see caring relationships, safety, opportunities for student engagement as just one more thing, or even as a distraction from meeting their accountability goals. They don't want to commit meaningful time and resources to those things, or in some cases they feel that they can't. So I'm wondering what you would say to a principal who holds that view, and what evidence you would use to back it up.
Well, it's a great question. I think it's consistent with, a lot of the research I'm sharing and the points of emphasis I made around that, and that is that, we've created a system it's very well intentioned, right? We love accountability in America, so ways that we want to hold people accountable. We've created a healthy system of testing, and so that has become one of, in many ways, the only way that we really think about accountability for schools. And again, it's not like we need to throw it out, but here's an interesting example. We have to get to a place where we have a healthier balance in relationship. We have to have a broader set of metrics that school leaders look at. They don't have to all be turned into accountability metrics, right? The best data is data that you collect for your own betterment. I mean, think about it, personal health data at an organizational level, right? I mean, if it's in the spirit of continuous improvement, that's about as valuable as any data you can possibly get your hands on, right? So I don't think that we need to turn all this into accountability measures. But we need to figure out what's a healthier balance. And so Texas I use as a good example. This was one of the first states to go running into the high-stakes testing arena. They're also one of the first states to run out of it to some extent. And in the last year, they passed a bill there that has reduced the number of required standardized tests for high schoolers from 15 to 5. Now, I'm not here to judge what the right amount is, okay, but obviously 15 sounds like an awful lot. 5, I don't know if that's perfect or not, but it sounds like a pretty good number. My point is that they cut the number of required standardized tests by 2/3. And so, part of it is we need to find ways to fight, to carve out time for things that we know matter a lot in school. And we can't wait for the system to change, because it won't happen fast enough. We can't wait for policy. I mean, there's several policy levers on this that will change, but we should just assume none of us should be waiting around for those things to happen. Because our power as an individual parent or teacher or principal or superintendent, here's my simple point, we can change this in spite of the system. The system may or may not help us, but we have the power to do that, and there's simple examples, right? So talk about craziness that I was just exposed to. I was told that my daughter's in kindergarten. She just started kindergarten, and they were really excited to tell me that they just increased recess from 10 minutes to 15 minutes a day. This is kindergarten, folks. I assure you I would have flunked out of kindergarten had I had recess for only 15 minutes a day. And everything we know about brain science and the connection between exercise and learning, I mean, like you look at this and you go, are we idiots? We've reduced exercise and playtime for kindergartners to 15 minutes a day. Look, that just doesn't pass the sniff test, right? You don't have to be an expert in education to go, something's wrong with that one. But unless you speak up, unless you have a conversation with other parents about, does that feel right? And how do you feel about that, right? I mean, I think this is a huge opportunity for civic engagement, because that's the only thing that's going to change this. And you look at what's shifting the tide on some of this testing stuff, it's moms primarily organizing around the test opt-out movement. Now, some of those are going really extreme to the other side of the pendulum, but my point here is that you've got examples of movement happening because of moms organizing, right? Citizens organizing. And you're also seeing a bit of this from students themselves who are kind of revolting around some of the things that are happening as part of the school day. But just think about this. If we could just carve out one period a day. By the way, this is Herculean for a typical school. But if we could just carve out one period a day, it's a simple example where a student can do a self-designed project that's a year-long engagement, that has guidance from a teacher or staff person, where it's something they're really interested in. That could be a way to just double the percentage of students who say they have a chance to do what they're best at. But see, it sounds so simple when you go, let's just find one 40-minute period of the day. But then you look at the demands that are placed on schools right now. They don't even have time for 15 minutes of recess. So my simple point is, let's not wait around for the system. The system's going to change because key constituents speak up. Students, parents, teachers, right? And the one thing I didn't share, and I'll just end on this point, teachers of all professions in the United States are dead last in saying that their opinions at work count. It's the worst piece of data I ever share. It's just, shame on our whole country that that's the case. Teachers of all professions, behind coal miners, truck drivers, and everybody else, are dead last on saying that they feel their opinions at work count. I mean, if we can't figure out how to elevate the opinions of teachers, I mean, you can see how fundamental that is, right? People always say that in a democracy that people died for the right to vote. Right? Everybody's heard that expression, right? Dying for the right to vote. I actually don't think it's true. I think there's something more fundamental that undergirds that, which is having your opinion heard and knowing that it counts. See, voting is just an expression of that. Voting is one way where you can have your opinion heard and know that it counts. But there are billions of other ways that we can make our opinions heard and matter. But you think about something so fundamental that it undergirds this expression of people dying for the right to vote. And teachers of all professions are dead last in feeling that their opinions at work count. We've got to fix that. Guess what? It doesn't cost any money to fix that. It's not easy to fix that. but that's a change in what we value, that's a change in the values we espouse, that's a change in the actions we take as leaders. And by the way, if your principal isn't going to step up and help encourage that environment, you and your fellow teachers can figure out some ways to do it yourself. And it might not be perfect, but there's ways that all of us can start to elevate this conversation. We're just maybe not imaginative enough and maybe not brave enough.
I wanted to double check on what you said because it's been my experience that foreign-born students and foreign-born people in general want to hit the ground running, start a new life, start their own business, and be successful in this country. You're saying that on a college level that you didn't really see any difference between those foreign-born and the regular students in terms of finding the things for well-being?
As it relates to, again, I'm just talking about the likelihood of being engaged in your work, whatever that work is, and the likelihood of thriving in your well-being. There were no noticeable differences. When I say noticeable, there might have been a small, statistically significant difference, but it's not what we would call meaningful in the grand scheme of things. And so to clarify, we actually have not cut that data by foreign-born college graduates. We know in the data set whether they were international students, so we could go look at that, but we have cut it by white, black, non-white Hispanic, Asian. We've also looked outside of race at first gen versus not. And there are no noticeable differences in the likelihood that those different groups hit the mark on the key 6 experiences. Little differences, right? So I'll give you a quick example. Asian graduates are less likely to say their professors cared about them as a person. They're less likely to say they had a mentor who encouraged their goals and dreams. So there are little differences, but they're not big ones. And there are no differences from socioeconomic status or by race on the likelihood of being engaged and thriving. Now, so good news, but I'll just give you a little a teaser for a report that's coming out in about a month. It gets more nuanced because if you look at, for example, black graduates from historically black colleges and universities compared to black graduates from any other type of university, there are indeed big differences on a number of those measures. And that's all I'm going to tell you. It's a little bit of a teaser, but I'll just say that it is going to be a very powerful case for HBCU institutions in that particular respect.
But you haven't measured foreign-born specifically.
No. Like I said, it's in our data set, so that's something we could look at, but we haven't specifically looked at students who are born international and completed college in the United States. But it's knowable. I just don't know what the answer is. Yeah.
Thank you. Mr. Busteed, I'm trying to figure out whether to be more inspired and validated or more depressed by some of the things you shared.
Go with the first one, please.
Yeah, okay. So I get you mentioned a couple of questions ago about some steps that people are taking to try to change the status quo in certain areas. You mentioned the importance of moms who get fed up and so on and deciding to opt out their children and so on. I was wondering if you have any outliers or any success stories, or if you know of anybody who has any success stories of people or groups or states or institutions that have tried to change some of these trends that are seem self-defeating.
Yeah. Here's the good news. I mean, there are little examples all over the country, right? The problem is not many of them are very visible yet. Not many of them have been brought to great scale. Most of the examples I can think of either schools or universities doing innovative things, they're really primarily driven by a dynamic leader, right, who has, and I'll give you an example. I mean, I won't name names, but a superintendent who started to work directly with us to measure the hope, engagement, and well-being of students in their district. And every time he would speak in a forum, he would have to start by saying, now, we're not taking our eye off the ball of grades and test scores. That's very important. But we also want to make sure that they're well-rounded students that are excited about coming to school each day, that are cared for by somebody in the building, right? I mean, so it was almost like even to kind of wage a campaign for more of that, you had to start with the, hey, we're still gonna hit the needle on, we're gonna hit the mark on that. So I see it as, kind of mentioned before, brave individuals and leaders who are helping their schools and institutions step out on these things. But here's the thing that's great news. So you could look at a lot of those stats and be pretty depressed, right? Because we're not doing very well on those measures that I've shared with you. But the best news is we've got nowhere to go but up. I mean, we're doing so poorly on those things that, I mean, this is the motivating thing for a school leader, a university leader, or a governor, whoever it is. You start wanting to measure these things, you got nowhere to go but up. It's all good news from here on out, right? I mean, you can improve for 10 consecutive years on these things and still not even be close to A grades, right? So I'm being a little funny, but let me just give you some very tangible examples of things that I see, right? So I was a startup organization in Boston, and somebody from Northeastern's co-op office came and visited with me. Now, here's a simple point. I was willing, as the CEO of a small startup company, to do and offer internships and co-op programs for students. But I wasn't going to Northeastern going, hey, I mean, I'm busy. I had all kinds of stuff going on. It wasn't on my agenda to go reach out. But somehow, somebody there from their co-op office reached out to me, spent 30 minutes in my office, and I went, this is a no-brainer. Let's do it. So the unique aspect of that is that they place students for 6 months. And see, that was really interesting because as a startup, I had no time to think about what I would throw somebody for the typical 6-week summer internship, right? Where the best you can do is say, oh, go get us some coffee and file these papers and all that kind of stuff. It takes work. But because I knew they were there for 6 months, I gave them real jobs. And because I was a startup, the first co-op student that we hired from Northeastern at $14 an hour, I kid you not, I made her our director of marketing because I didn't have one. I gave her a real job. And she did a fantastic job, and we hired her. And we ended up having co-op students in this tiny little organization for 11 consecutive years because of one 30-minute meeting that somebody from their office figured out how to do. I would argue that cost Northeastern almost $0. But the difference is just huge. So here's the thing. I think on things like internships where we connect learning, we are so unimaginative, it's unbelievable. We think about the obvious Fortune 500 employers in a city, but it's all the small and medium businesses whose names are not well known that are all the really, really large opportunities are for internships. And the quality of those internships, I would argue, are going to be better because like me, a 12-person organization at the time, I got so much more value out of that co-op student than an organization that would have been 5,000 employees. There's no doubt about it. So, I mean, these are little examples that I think are, and here's another one, universities, right? You say, okay, how can we increase mentoring for college and universities? Because that sounds very labor intensive, doesn't it? How on earth could we scale mentoring? 2 quick examples. Think of a pyramid and the human capital assets that exist around a university. Faculty are the smallest part of that, the tip of the pyramid. Then you've got staff, which is a slightly bigger number. Then you've got currently enrolled students, which is a slightly bigger number. And then at the base, the largest human capital asset of a university is alumni. Now, how are all the ways that we've engaged alumni as universities? I would argue only one way. Will you write a check? We have run capital campaigns. We have not attempted a human capital campaign. But how many of you as an alum of your alma mater, if they reached out to you and gave you a protocol for mentoring a current undergraduate, would sign up to do that in a second? I know I would. And here's the thing, just take data from my alma mater. There's about 140,000 living alumni. There's 6,000 current undergraduates. If you got just 10% of our alumni to volunteer to do that, which sounds like a pretty reasonable number to shoot for, you'd have 2 times more mentors than students, just in that simple math alone. So, I mean, can we do this? Yes. Western Governors University, which is an adult-only online university, is the best university we've measured in the percentage of their grads who say they had a mentor who encouraged their goals and dreams. No one would ever get that because you'd go, how's that possible? It's an online university. Their model invests in professional advisors who mentor students one-on-one every week for an hour from the second they matriculate to the second they graduate. And guess what? It's all done on Google Hangout, on Skype, on IM, on phone, and on email. They never meet in person. But can you imagine the power of that relationship? So don't also think that this just has to be in person, and don't think that it just has to be the faculty to student. Those are very powerful examples of mentoring. We're just not stretching ourselves. But if we set out a goal to say, I want 90% of my students to leave here having had a mentor relationship, there are universities that will hit that mark inside of 2 or 3 years. We just haven't even given it an attempt.
Hi. So I have a son who is a drummer, and in all likelihood, if given the chance, he would do that to the exclusion of pretty much all else. I'm just wondering if there are any good examples that you might have of institutions that are doing the following your talent or building your strength well, without abandoning sort of the diversified skill set and well-rounded scholar that we all value.
Yeah. Again, I want to stretch this. I hate this to sound like a throwaway answer, right? You know, we're being very unimaginative in the different ways we can do this. You know, you think about, by the way, one of the things I think is one of the most powerful examples of learning and teaching is project-based learning, for example, right? And there are schools who are building their whole school curriculum around teaching everything through the lens of project-based learning. I mean, and you can do this for everything. You can do this in Intro to Spanish. I mean, I've seen it, once you understand what it is, teachers start to figure it out. They kind of run with it. So, but I mean, you know, you think about the example of combining interests and talents with what you're learning. I mean, it could be as simple as, if I'm a teacher who knows that this is a student who lights up over music and drumming, I can teach math through the lens of music examples. My son's 4.5. Anything I want to teach him, I have to teach it through the lens of superheroes, right? And that's Harrison at 4.5. At 8, it's probably going to be different. But what I need to know is what lights him up or what lights her up, and how can I connect that, even if it's in small, simple ways. Now, there's more profound ways of connecting that, right? Where, you actually think about something that could be a real career trajectory. Let's just say that he wants to be a professional drummer. Who's to say no right now? I mean, we still have to be practical. We can be optimistic, but we have to be practical. We have to think about alternative pathways if drumming doesn't work out. But in simple ways, you know, he might be excited to go to school simply because he gets to drum at one period during the day. Honestly, I used to get excited to go to school because I wanted to compete in kickball at recess. I'm being very honest. That's what I got excited about. I couldn't wait for recess because I wanted to go play kickball. And school was kind of cool as part of that, right? So I learned, I tried to get good grades, but what got me excited about going to school was that. So if anything else, if we use that as an opportunity to get them excited to come to the building, just to show up at the building, I mean, there's half the battle right there. And so I would worry less about the content we're teaching students right now. We get very worked up over the content. And I would worry more about how we're teaching it, right? About how we're connecting it to any kind of emotion they might have. An interest, a passion, or just something that's interesting and exciting, right? And so, you know, look, we can all do this. Some teachers are far better at others. Some it comes very naturally for. Some it takes a lot of professional development and experience. But we're not really pushing ourselves on that. I mean, I saw an example of project-based learning in Intro to Spanish, and I'll tell you this because once you hear the example, you just start to realize all the ways you can connect learning with real stuff. And they were working in groups of 3, and their assignment was to create an imaginary vacation to a Latin American country. And they were going to create a postcard that they were going to send home that would describe in Spanish what they did on that imaginary vacation. And so one kid was looking up, how do you translate parasailing in Spanish? The other one was working on the design of the postcard because they actually made a real postcard. But I mean, I just give you that example because that's Intro to Spanish, and most people would go, well, how do you do project-based learning in Intro to Spanish? But think of what they did. That exercise, in addition to being a great team project, what else did it do? It got them excited about the future. Because they thought about, well, where will we go on vacation? And all of a sudden, that gave me energy because I go to a happy place, and then I think about what I want to do on that vacation. These examples are so simple. I think we just need to allow ourselves to go there, and once it happens, it starts to happen. Buildings that, you know, I'll give you a quick example. At New Tech High in Napa Valley, California, they have a teacher there who does nothing but teach project-based learning to other teachers. And I asked her, I said, well, how did you learn how to do this? And she goes, well, I just started doing it in my own classroom. I got good at it, and everybody asked me if I could teach other teachers. So that's how she got that job. But she's like, I had none of that training when I went through college. No one ever taught me how to do that. She's like, most teachers have never been taught how to do that. She said, but once I get them going, she said, it's kind of rough for the first semester that they try to do a lot of project-based learning woven in the curriculum. She said, after I get them past the first semester, she said, they just take off. So see, this is not rocket science. It might be a semester worth of investment for a teacher to kind of get their sea legs on project-based learning. But I think a lot of passion and interest in learning, it's simple ways to connect it. I mean, you know, I gave you a specific example, drumming, but I think it's just using it as something that actually engages their mind. If a kid likes cars, talk about things through the lens of cars. We can do that.
Sorry. Brandon, once again, thank you for your speech today. But going back to integrating the workforce and education, with the onset of the information you shared from Google and in the news report that in the UK, Ernst & Young is no longer considering four-year degrees, how do you see the American community college system playing a role, and more so, how can they take advantage of this so-called paradigm shift in education and employment?
Yeah, well, it's an awesome question because I think they have a leg up relative to one really important factor. They, more than any other type of educational institution in the U.S., have relationships with employers. That sounds so simple. And I'm not just talking about businesses. When I say employers, I'm talking about all types of employers, small, medium, large, for-profit, nonprofit, government, right, state, local, federal, right? I'm putting it all into that category. And you know, the Northeastern Co-op example, right? I mean, they've curated relationships with a startup, like my example, outside the classroom, that lasted 12 years based on one 30-minute meeting. And so it goes many ways. You know, the obvious things like offering internship and work experiences for students, which I think community colleges are excelling at, right? They're excelling at working with employers to create programs and curriculum that align with high-demand jobs, right? So you think about high-tech manufacturing. There are a boatload of opportunities for high-tech manufacturing in this country right now. And those kinds of companies are struggling to find qualified technicians, many of whom can make an awful lot of money. And so, you know, but they partnered with a business in some of these situations. But by the way, there's a natural bias in higher ed to this kind of stuff, right? We don't want to think that businesses are driving our curriculum. We don't want to think that, you know, our research was influenced by a company. I mean, there's real reasons why we have a little bit of a standoffish attitude around this, but we've got to break through that and focus on what are the really valuable examples of great collaboration. And in simple terms, I've been in rooms, I kid you not, in relatively small cities where the superintendents, the college presidents in the town, and some of the top CEOs of the biggest employers have met each other for the first time because they came to this session. They were like meeting each other. And I said, you guys didn't know each other until right now? I mean, so they're not even sitting down and meeting together in most of these situations. So back to your point, community colleges have at least established a long track record and a history and a methodology for working closely with local employers. And I think all of our solutions, this is going to sound like a throwaway, kind of answer too, but almost all of our solutions are going to come at a local and regional level. For education, for employment, right? It's not a national economy, it's a local and regional economy, and so that's also where community colleges have excelled because they primarily serve the local economy and they have no ambition to do anything beyond that. They know their role, but you think about the average university today, they want to serve globally, they want to serve nationally, they want to be internationally known, they want to do this, they want to do that. I just take Duke University, love my alma mater, but what is Duke University? Duke University is a hospital system. They run a hospital. Duke University is a professional sports organization. They run a professional sports organization. Duke University is a place for students. It's a university. Duke University is, you go down this as a research organization that's doing research to help cure diseases and all kinds of other stuff. That's almost like a multinational conglomerate. I mean, that's serving so many different purposes, and that's very challenging. So I think if we can take models from community college and expand those, very simple terms, stronger relationships between employers and the education system. And there's 900 ways to describe that, but I think community colleges are a great example for us to hold up. Thanks.
Very well done.
Yeah,
Very
appreciate
well
it.
Thank you all very much. Yeah, just sit for a second. Today at the City Club, we've been enjoying a forum with Brandon Busteed, Executive Director of Education and Workforce Development at Gallup. Thank you very much, Brandon. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. This forum is now adjourned.